So, welcome everybody. This is such a pleasure to be able to do this from the comfort of my home and not even having to get on an airplane and fly to all your cities within an hour. So I really appreciate O'Reilly letting me do this. And, of course, I love talking about entity framework. So, 50 minutes, that's a little rough for me because I could just go on and on and on. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly so you get a good overview and give you links, etc., so you can find more information. So there's certainly more than 10 treats in the new version of the Entity Framework, but again, given the time, I had to work really hard to pick my 10 favorites, and that shifts constantly. I've done this presentation a few times, and every time I do it, I change my list of what I'm excited about this week. Just a little bit about me. I actually have already written a book on Entity Framework. I did that based on the first version that's in Visual Studio 2008. And just about as soon as I finished that, I had to get started on writing a new version, so I'm working on that right now. Here's my information for my website, and my blog is on my website. I'm Twittering at Julie Lerman Vermont, or VT. There's a website specifically for the book, so there's downloads and things like that from the books. And the other thing that you should know is that even though I'm still working on the book, it's available, early bits of it, and some of the chapters are currently available already on Rough Cuts. And I'm working hard to get it done. Hopefully it'll be out in print in the spring. I don't mean March, though. Not quite that early in the spring, more in the late spring. So, Rough Cuts are rough. They haven't gone through the copy editing process and things like that, but I've got a lot of great tech reviewers helping me make sure that I didn't miss anything. So the Rough Cuts will be pretty good. So, and there's the link to get at them if you want. So what I'm going to go over today is a handful of the improvements that are made to the designer as we move from Visual Studio 2008 to 2010. As a matter of fact, the focus of this whole presentation is looking at some of the new things that we're really happy to see. So if you're brand new to Entity Framework, this will still be pretty good information, but if you've been using Entity Framework version 1 in Visual Studio 2008, you're going to see a lot of things that have been pain points for us that are getting a lot better in Visual Studio 2010. So I'll go over some of the things in the designer, and then rather than reading this list of what's in what I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to go ahead and start talking about it. So one of the big complaints and problems for us in the current version, the Visual Studio 2008 version, is if we're creating a model based on a database, and in Visual Studio 2008, that's really the only way to do it, to reverse engineer a database into a model. We have to spend a lot of time fixing up the names because the model wizard doesn't know how to deal with singular and plural names. If you've used Link to SQL, you're used to that designer actually knows, that wizard knows how to do that. So it was really frustrating for us because it was a lot of work and manual labor. And if you have 100 or 120 entities in your model and you have to go and start renaming the entities and navigation properties and things like that every time you create a new model, it's really a drag. So the new designer is a lot smarter, and I'll just show you a quick look at that. So this is, the type of demo you've probably seen 100,000 times for Entity Framework, but I'm going to go ahead and add a new model. I'm just going to reverse engineer an existing database.
Hey, Julie, sorry to interrupt. Someone has requested that you please speak up.
All right, I will try to keep that in mind. Thank you for the reminder.
I know it's very hard to do.
And I don't mind being interrupted to be reminded.
Great.
It's a funny thing when I'm presenting live in front of an audience. I don't even need a microphone because I talk too loud. But when I'm sitting here in my quiet office, seemingly talking to myself, it's a little different. So I'll go ahead and just do this typical thing of reverse engineering a database. And one thing you might notice if you haven't seen Visual Studio 2010 before is there's some checkboxes down on the bottom, and the one I want to focus on is the one that says pluralize or singularize generated object names. That's checked by default. So you don't have to take advantage of that if for some reason you don't want to take advantage of their way of doing pluralization. So I'm going to go ahead and check all the tables, and if you look in here, you'll notice that the naming is kind of all over the place. I've got tables that are singular names, and I've got tables that are plural names, and I've also got some tables in here that will pose some interesting challenges for pluralization. So I'm going to go ahead and let that finish and create the model, and then we'll just take a look at some of the names. For example, the entity generated from the table called, this entity here called brewery was generated from a table called breweries. And that's even harder to say after you've had a few beers, right? So it recognized that that was plural, and also it wasn't just a matter of taking the S off. It was a little more interesting than doing that. There was a table called address says. Again, not a simple, typical way of going from plural to singular, so it fixed that into address. Now if we look at some of the entity set names, so for the entity person, you can see the entity set name has automatically been named people. So we've got that with the entity set names, but also the entities have been made singular. The entity sets are plural. But don't forget the navigation properties. The wizard has also taken care of the naming there. So when you have a relationship, for example, in customer has a relationship to person. It's got that as singular. It also has a relationship to the credit card entity, but that's a one-to-many relationship. So it's going to be multiple credit cards, and it named that properly. So it takes care of not only the entity names, but it takes care of the navigation property names also, and the entity and entity set names along with the navigation properties. Not everything's perfect. For example, I had a table called movies, and it used the same way of singularizing that as it did with brewery, and came up with MOVY. So it's not perfect. And also the way this works, it's not the same as spelling dictionaries where you can actually have open up a file and add your own ways of translating a name from singular to plural. That would be nice, because then we could add our own little fixes in there. I could add in movies equals movie, and I don't have to worry about it becoming movie. But there is something to be aware of. It's called the pluralization service. So that's inside of the Entity Framework APIs, and it's something that you can code to impact how the pluralization works. You can also totally turn the pluralization off also. So the pluralization, from the perspective of somebody who's never used Entity Framework before, you might think of that and say, well, duh, why is that a big deal? If you've used Visual Studio 2008, it is a big deal because we did not have it before. Another thing that's really important for a lot of people is this fact that the Visual Studio 2008 designer, really all it supported for creating models was reverse engineering. There is and was an option to create an empty model, but if you started with an empty model, you could create entities and relationships between them, etc. You could design the model, but if you wanted to wire that model up to a database, that was pretty hard. So in the new version, they actually make that really easy to do. There's a context menu item called Generate Database from Model, and I'll just show that to you quickly. Back to Visual Studio. So I'll just create a little itty-bitty model, and we'll generate a database from there. We'll just generate the database script. We won't go ahead and run it. empty model. So the tools for adding entities into a model are not new. They were here before. You can do it through the context menu. There's also tools that you can drag and drop from the toolbox. So if I was doing it this way, what do I want to do? How about ski resorts? Because I'm thinking about skiing because the snow is coming back. We just had our January thaw in one day. And we'll add a couple of properties to it, name, and number of lifts. And when you're creating if you've never created entities this way, don't forget to go and modify the properties and make them what you want them to be. So this would be an int. This is fine. This is the default is a string. So you've got all these things you need to pay attention to in here. And notice also when I created the entity, the ID field was already there when we looked at when I saw the little dialog box. And also see that it assumed that this should be a store-generated an identity key. Okay, so that will get taken into account when I create the script for the database. I'll just create one more entity, and it'll be days I skied there. And I'm not going to worry about changing the name of that. And this should be days. It would be an integer. I'm not going to worry about that either right now. And then I can go ahead and create a relationship between the two. And that automatically became a one-to-many relationship, but I can change that if I want to. And so I'm not going to worry too much about that. But the idea is, for each ski resort, hopefully I'll log, this wouldn't be days, this would be date, right? I'll log each date that I skied there, so there's a one-to-many relationship. So there's a lot you can do here. As you're defining these entities, focus on the properties of the properties, the attributes of the properties, and consider how you're going to want that to impact the creation of the database. Once I've got that, now I can just click Generate Database from Model, and I need to point to the database, the connection. So this won't actually create the database. It's going to create the schema for the database. And I accidentally didn't start with an existing database. That doesn't matter. I'm just randomly pointing to one because I'm not going to write it to actually run this. But what this did was it just created T-SQL for me to go ahead and create the tables. And also, you'll see it's creating the primary key, foreign key constraints based on the associations. Right, all of that stuff is in there. If we look back up here, it identified the identity keys. So it's getting all of that from the model that I created. So you don't have to reverse engineer from databases anymore. You can go ahead and define a model and generate this DDL from it, and then of course you would take this and then give it to your DBA and along with a box of candy and say, can you please run this for me and create my databases, and if you need to fix anything up, just let me know and we'll work that out. Right? Got to always pay attention to those DBAs because we need them, the data administrators and the designers. So this is a really important thing for a lot of people. We're not always starting with existing databases. Some of us are fortunate enough to actually start brand new applications, right? And have to create the database from there. Additionally, when you create the model this way and generate the database, it will also generate the SSDL and the mappings between them based on the database schema that it's creating. So you get the whole set of metadata, not just the model. Another really important new feature in the designer, something we complained about a lot. The Visual Studio 2008 has a bunch of stored procedure support, but there are some important scenarios and one really important scenario that it didn't support, and now it does that really important scenario. Previously, when we had a stored procedure in our database and we wanted to bring it into our entity model so that we could actually use it, we only had access to be able to map stored procedures that either return scalar values or return something that mapped directly to an entity. But if it didn't map directly to an entity, we couldn't use it. So, and there was no way to bring it into the model. So now there's support for that, and I'll just show you quickly how that works. It's really sweet. So did I bring my stored procedures in? Oh, I'm looking at the wrong model. If we go back to the first model that I created and go to the model browser, I'll see that I didn't bring the stored procedures in. So I'm going to go ahead and update the model from the database, and I'm going to pull the stored procedures in this time. This update wizard is not new, so I'll just pull them all in so I don't have to worry about it. And now I can see the stored procedures. So if you've never, the model browser is also not new. It's very handy. I think a lot of people don't realize it's there and the value of looking at it. So this top part just shows you the actual conceptual model, and the bottom part you can actually take a look at the structure of what's inside the SSDL, which describes your database. So here are the stored procedures that I pulled in, and this is just what's being described in the store model. It's not actually, none of this is in, these are not in my conceptual model. I have to bring them in. So I'll use a feature that was already in Visual Studio 2008, which is I'll right-click on the stored procedure that I want and say Add Function Import. And again, what's new here is this ability to return a complex type. So a complex type is something, it'll be a type, it'll be in our model. It's not an entity, though, but it's a type, and it'll get strong typing when we're working with it. So we'll have actual classes. So when you run this, we'll actually be returning to objects rather than, maybe an anonymous type or something like that. So I've selected my stored procedure name and the stored procedure I want to work with. And the way that this works is the first thing I want to do is click on this Get Column Information. And it's going to go and actually execute in the background. It'll execute the stored procedure so that it can see what the schema is of the results. And then it's showing us here what the schema is of the results. Now I can click on the Create New Complex Type button, and it will actually create a new complex type for me. It automatically names it with this underscore result, which is kind of ugly, but it's a good start, and this would make sense to be get. So I'm going to click on OK, and what's going to happen is my model will get a new complex type, but also my object context will get a new function called Get Order Since Date by Salesperson. We'll take a look at that. So now looking in the schema of the model, the complex type is not an entity, so it's not going to show up on the design surface, but we can see it in here. So there's the new complex type, and here we can see it's got a first property. Here's the attributes of it down here. Okay? But more importantly, well, not more importantly, as importantly, I go to my entity. There's a new section. There's a new section. Oh, not my entities. I want my context. I was right the first time I headed for context, wasn't I? Okay, so there's a new section here called Function Imports, and that function that I imported was automatically generated as a method. So the method is called Get Order Since Date by Salesperson, and it returns a set of those complex types. So again, because they're not entities, You don't have an entity key. You're not going to get change tracking or anything like that with them. But now we've got nice, strongly typed objects that we're going to return and an easy way to get at them. So that's what I wanted to show you from the designer. There's a lot more to look at, so we'll just move on. But there's many, many more nice additions to the designer, lots of new stuff. But these, to me, are kind of the big three. Another one, actually, that's a kind of a biggie, but I couldn't fit it into the top 10 list, is the complex type support. So that's definitely something to look at, and I've written about that in my blog. I've written about it in a bunch of articles, and plenty of other people have talked about it as well. Okay, so moving away from the designer, but since it's still related to the model, is that there's now foreign key support in Entity Framework. And again, for those of you who haven't used Entity Framework before, you might be thinking, well, yeah, why wouldn't there be? So in the first version of Entity Framework, the model was pretty strictly based on entity relationship modeling. And in entity relationship models, you don't expose the foreign keys. All the relationships are defined through the navigations. But there was just a lot of challenges with not having the foreign keys exposed. So, for the most part, without the foreign keys, you can query, you can create relationships between things. So you can, create an order and attach it to a customer. You don't need to set the customer ID in order to do that. You can still work that way. You still get all of those benefits, but in addition, with the foreign keys now, the option of now exposing the foreign keys in the model, it makes it easier to do things like just assign an ID when you don't want to have to work with a specific entity. Another place that this is really helpful is if you're writing services and you don't want to have to worry about relationships, especially when you're crossing processes. You just want to get an ID in there and just have it there and not have to worry about building graphs and modifying how the relationships are seen as you go from a client back over to a service or something like that. Another place where I found that it's really helpful to have, not just helpful, but necessary to have the foreign keys, is if you're working with graphs in a web page and in the markup, you need to be able to identify relationships and how to navigate from one thing to another. And in the markup, say you're doing a master detail page, you do need access to that foreign key property. And what I was doing was using partial classes to create a foreign key property that had a getter and a setter. So I was writing that logic in there myself. So there's a lot of places where you can benefit from foreign keys. And so what Microsoft has done now, I'm just going to flip back to the wizard so you can, I'll just, as if I'm going to create a new one, I just wanted to point out in the wizard, Model 3, we're going to have a lot of models today. Okay, so down here, do you see the check mark for, zooming? Although the zoom doesn't look so good on WebEx, does it? But do you see include foreign key columns in the model? That's checked by default. Okay, so that's the default behavior now. And the foreign keys is not just about the designer being able to bring the foreign keys in. There's a lot that happens in the APIs so that they understand how to work with foreign keys. Another nice thing, just to point out, I don't have time to demo all of this, is that if you have a foreign key in your model, and I just want to scroll to an example of one. So here's a credit card. So credit card has the customer ID foreign key. It still has the customer navigation property. And if you've been working with Entity Framework, you're probably familiar with the entity references. So it's not in the model, but there's also something called customer reference that you can access, and that's how we would drill in to find that entity key. So one thing that's really nice that the APIs do, if you have the foreign key in here, is it can keep the foreign key and the navigation property and that entity reference in sync. So if you change the customer for credit card, if you set credit card.customer to a new customer instance, automatically the customer ID will be updated to reflect the ID of that new customer instance, and the entity key of the customer reference will be updated. So, and if you change the customer ID to a new ID, if that customer exists in memory, that will be pulled in, and that will become the new customer instance for the credit card. So it keeps all of that stuff in sync, and it's all backwards compatible too. So you don't have to use the foreign keys. The other thing to be aware of when you're looking at the foreign keys, especially if you've been using Entity Framework already, is it does have an effect on how the associations are built. Without foreign keys, the associations are defined through the mappings, not literally in the model. But when and that's called, by the way, that's referred to as an independent association. And when the foreign key is there, though, if you're familiar with this, we look at one thing you might notice if you're used to Visual Studio 2008, we would normally be able to have a mapping, get at the mappings for this association. But because this association is built on foreign keys, there is no more mapping, and it's defined over here in a referential constraint, which is directly in the conceptual model. So that's in there. It shows how we go from the customer to the credit cards to the customer's personal ID and the credit cards .customer ID. So that's all now defined right in the conceptual model. And you can have them mixed also. You can have foreign key associations and independent associations in the same model. So I could go on and on about foreign keys, but since we only have a certain amount of time, I'm going to move on. So here's another feature that's been important for a lot of people who have been using other ORMs, even linked to SQL, is to have lazy loading. And we did not have lazy loading in Entity Framework, in the first version of Entity Framework. And for those of you who are not familiar with lazy loading, what it means is if I have a customer, if I've queried for a customer and instantiated that, then I say, okay, I want to see the customer's credit cards. And if I just said customer.creditcards, what lazy loading would do is say, oh wait, just 1 second, we haven't loaded those yet, and it will, in the background, go and run a query and execute that query and bring those credit cards back on the fly for us, so we don't have to explicitly go out and get those credit cards. That's what lazy loading is. It's very convenient. It's also potentially dangerous. It's important to be aware of what lazy loading is doing, and it's hitting to the database. You may want to have more control over when trips are made to the database. Anyway, so lazy loading, the way that's achieved is through the object context, and there's a new property called context options, and within context options, there's lazy loading enabled. And lazy loading enabled, it's a Boolean, and it is on by default. And I want to now, how can a true setting be on by default? Because normally all setting, Boolean is false, right, until you explicitly make it true. So the way this is on by default is that in the model, when this is for new models. That's the important thing. When you create a new model, it will be on by default. And the reason is because when a new model is generated, the wizard will put, I got to get to the right spot here. It'll put this annotation into the entity container. Lazy loading enabled equals true. Based on that, the default code generator will read that, because the annotations are notes for the code generator. The code generator will read that, and then in the constructors for the object context, it will put lazy loading equals true in there. Okay, so that's how it's possible for it to be quote unquote on or true by default. Okay, and you can turn it on and off as you're working. But the important thing, especially for people who've used ORMs before, is to understand that this is tied to the context. Okay, so it's as you're working with a context, you can affect whether or not things will get lazily loaded. In other ORMs, there's sometimes the lazy loading can be defined by a property. So you could say something like customer.creditcards, always, no matter what, always lazy load that for me. But that's not the way it works here. Here it's just by the context instance. Okay, so that's how that's affected. So moving on because of the time. All right, so one thing I mentioned when I was talking about the code generation was that I said the default code generation. Okay, in Visual Studio 2008, I'll back up a little bit for people who haven't used Entity Framework before. What happens after you've created a model is that you've seen me open up these classes. Entity Framework will generate classes based on the model. So it reads the model, and then it generates classes based on that model. So that's the intro to Entity Framework session. So we'll unfortunately don't have time for that. The way this was done in Visual Studio 2008 was using a proprietary code generator that the Entity Framework team wrote. It was really hard to work with, and most people didn't bother even considering modifying how the code generation was happening. So what they did this time around was take advantage of something that's actually been in Visual Studio since Visual Studio 2008, which is called T4. That's what we generally call it. That stands for Text Template Transformation Toolkit. So it's a code generator, like CodeSmith or something like that. But now the Entity Framework classes and the entities, everything that's generated from the model will get generated using T4. And the nice thing about that is that it's more commonly known. You know, people understand that the T4 better than the proprietary APIs that the Entity Framework team had originally written. And also, if you haven't used it before and you do make an investment into learning it so that you can work with Entity Framework, now you've got a tool that you can use through in many other places in Visual Studio. So I'm just going to give you a quick look at that, although we're going to be doing some other things in some of the other top 10 treats that will continue to take advantage of that. So the T4 template that's used by default is kind of buried somewhere in your system when you install Visual Studio. But if we wanted to modify that, the way we do that is, hey, what did I do to my model? Must have really screwed it up, huh? Let me open that back up. And what did I do? What did I do? I might just create a new one. Or, you know, I'll just use this one. Doesn't matter. Just so long as that one, I did an okay job with it. It's not mapped. Right, because I didn't do the whole thing. All right. We're just going to do this again. I want to make sure that I do this right. We'll do another model. Generate from database. We'll do the same one. We'll just include everything for fun, and we'll click Finish. Okay, that makes 100,003 times that you've seen this one now. All right, so again, that used the default code generator to create the code. What I want to do now is say, well, I want to change something. There's something about the way this code generation is done that I don't like. I want to change the behavior of it. So just as I'm just going to grab a random example. Here, this data contract attribute. Maybe I am never going to use this model and use these entities in WCF services. So I don't need that data contract attribute. So I want to customize how that code generation is done. So I'm going to right-click here and select Add Code Generation Item. Okay. Now, when you install Visual Studio, you'll some of these were added after the fact. We'll look at those in a minute. But this is the default one. And this will always be there. The ADO.NET Entity Object Generator. Okay, so that creates that's the default template. So what I'm going to do is by selecting this, it's going to go and grab that template, make a copy of it, and put the copy into my solution. That's part of what happens. Okay, so it's here. I expected it to be named Model 3 TT, but it's not. So it's here. So the first thing I want to show you is that if I look at the classes generated from the model, they're no longer there. The code generator is taking over for us, so we're not going to have these. They used to just eliminate this in earlier versions of Dev 10, but they left that in here along with a note because it's, A, it was kind of confusing, and B, people sometimes want to bring back the default. So there's a note in there for how to do that. So the template, we're not going to spend very much time looking at the template. There's a lot going on in here. Essentially, the template has two sections in it. One section is what I want you to do with my model, how I want you to create the classes based on my model. And the other section of it is way down at the bottom, which is helper methods. Okay, so code up here calls helper methods that are down below. So you wouldn't necessarily modify the helper methods, although you might add your own helper methods. All right, so but the code up here, the commands of how to create the classes, is where you would make changes. If you've never looked at T4 before, within here there's two essential things to be aware of. One is there's just text that gets spit out, and then there's processing commands. So everything inside of these tags is a processing command, kind of like in ASP, right, except the percent signs. I'm using an extension, a Visual Studio extension called the T4 Editor to give me all this nice coloring and highlighting and stuff. By default, Visual Studio 2010 doesn't do that for you. So I could go in here and take out that data contract. I'm just going to scroll down, close your eyes so you don't get dizzy. And I could go ahead and take this out. And then when I save it, it resaves my classes. And if I open up the entities, I'll see that data contract is gone. Okay, so there's a lot to learn about T4. There's a lot to learn about the specialized code in this T4 model. But I'm still creating entity objects, right? That's the only thing I've done to it. Only change I made was to take out that data contract. Okay, so the next thing I want to focus on is this entity object. This is a big problem for a lot of people, the fact that all these classes derive from entity object. For many of us, it's perfectly fine, right? It gives us all the functionality we need, and we're done with it. But if you're doing any agile development, if you unit test, if you need persistence ignorance, and a whole lot of other reasons, that entity object is a real problem. It's the fact that my classes are inheriting from something that's bound to the entity framework poses a problem for a lot of people. So this is, for me, actually one of the biggest changes, most important changes in Entity Framework, is the fact that it supports POCO classes. POCO stands for plain old CLR objects, and For those of you who think it means plain old C# objects, you're just wrong. It also supports VB. So the way the POCO support essentially works is that it's by convention. So if you have a simple class that's not an entity object, it'll jump into using the POCO support. But it's important for each property, the names of your names of your entities, the names of your properties, and the types of your properties to line up with the entities in your model. That's how it's going to figure out how to get back and forth from your model to your classes. So you don't need to have the entity object anymore. And there's two ways that this works. One is by doing snapshots. So with entity objects constantly notify the object context, and that's how the context is able to keep track of the entity state and how the relationships are being set up between the different entities. So that's by notification. But since these are simple classes, don't inherit from entity object, they won't know how to do notification. So instead now the context has a couple of new methods that allow us to say, hey, what's going on inside of the entity? Okay. There's another way to leverage the POCO support, which is by proxy. There's a special way of setting it up. I'll show you in a moment. And when you use the proxies, then it actually at runtime, it spins up these dynamic proxies and adds extra stuff to your classes to let them do the notification, so you get a lot of the same behavior you're used to. And also, so to get to these simple classes, you might already have classes and then you're just going to plug them into your Entity Framework solution, or you might be starting with a model and you might want to create simple classes. So there are some canned templates. That was what those extra templates that you saw when I opened up the Add Code Generation item wizard. So let me flip over to this. I'm watching the clock going, oh no, here we go again. So much to talk about. So I'm going to flip over to a different solution so we can take a quick look at how the proxies, how the POCOs work. So I have a simple model here. It's similar to the one we've been looking at, and to me that's simple. Although if it had 3 entities in it, it might be even simpler. And I have some entities that I've already created, some very simplistic entities. So I'm going to open up the person entity, and what's important about this entity is that its name aligns with an entity in the model, and it has properties that align with an entity in the model. Okay. Now this is not a DTO. I just wanted to point out I've just created this very simply, but you can certainly have business logic in here. You can have properties in here that don't have anything to do with the model. That's fine, just so long as everything in this entity has an associated property that it can relate to in the class, and it'll all work fine. So simple, nothing to do with the entity objects, but because it doesn't have any entity object in there, it's not going to know how to talk to the context. Therefore, the context needs to know how to talk to the entity. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through this little demo and show you a little bit of how this works. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just query. I'm going to grab one person. We'll take a look at the person. And, it's as simple as can be, right? Now, the lazy loading we talked about. With lazy loading on by default, my expectation is when I call this favorite beer, when I ask for the favorite beers, even though I didn't request them in this original query, that Entity Framework in the background should go ahead and make a call to the database, execute a query in the database, and bring back those favorite beers. But it didn't, right? And it didn't because I'm using the POCO objects. So in the snapshot way of having POCOs you do not get lazy loading. You have to explicitly load. All right. Visual Studio 2008, we actually loaded from the properties. We would have said person.favoritebeers.load, but favorite beers doesn't know anything about entity objects, and therefore it doesn't know anything about loading. So one of the new methods in the context knows now how to go and do the loading. So this load property method allows me to say, for this person, go ahead and load the favorite beers. So I'll go grab those, and now that I've loaded them, we can see that, oh, there's only one? Well, maybe not a big drinker, right? So we got the explicit loading, but it's just a new way of doing it, but we can still do that with the POCO objects, just not the lazy loading. All right, there is a way to do lazy loading. I'll show you in a minute, so don't freak out if you're going, wait a minute, I want both of these things. So the other thing is the change tracking, right? So with an entity object, when I make a change, if I go into the object state entries of the context, I would be able to see what I'm doing here is I'm asking the context to tell me how many modified items it's aware of. Okay, now I just modified something, so I would expect it to say 1, but it's saying 0. And again, that's because I'm using these simple POCO objects. The POCO object did not know how to communicate that to the object context. So what we can do instead is there's a method called detect changes. That's new also for the context. So this is the snapshot again. The context is going to now go and take a look at what's going on with all the entities that it's managing. Okay, so now I'm going to go back and say, now do you know about any modified entities? And it found that. So by using detect changes and taking the snapshot, the context is now aware of changes to the entities, and when I call save changes, it will be able to go and create the update commands. Now, save changes in the new version will automatically call detect changes for you, so you don't have to make this explicit call. However, there are other times that you might want to inspect the object state manager, or you need the context to be aware of changes, so you might need to explicitly call that. So that was looking at the snapshot POCOs. Now I want to show you how the proxies work, again, just at a high level. And I'm just going to switch over to this set of entities. So here I have entities set up in a way that I'll be able to get the dynamic proxies at runtime. And the way you do that is you have to mark every single property as virtual. All right? If you leave one out, then you won't get that behavior. All right? Now, there's one thing I do want to point out, which is for the lazy loading, if you don't want to get the dynamic proxies that we're about to see, but you do want the lazy loading, you can just make put the virtual keyword on the navigation properties. So those will get lazily loaded, but you just won't get all of the other behavior that you would expect if you were doing this, which is marking everything as virtual and thereby making this POCO play into the dynamic proxies and taking advantage of that. So let's run through that same code again, but I'm going to be using these classes that are virtual instead of the simpler classes. So again, this doesn't impact my ability to have persistence ignorance or do unit testing. I'm not deriving from entity object. I'm just putting this little virtual tag here, and what it does is it impacts things at runtime. All right, and still, this is there are developers, agile developers who don't like this either. There's a lot of rules along with using virtual, and there's also, in some cases there might be behavior that is not what you want it to be, depending on what you're used to for working with an ORM. But essentially, this is what Microsoft sees as the default way of using the POCOs. So we'll run through again this, and the first thing I want you to notice is this person is now no longer the nice simple person it was last time. I've got all of these, the properties certainly look very different, and if you look at favorite beers, try that again. I'm not sure why the resolution is doing that when I'm zooming in, but favorite beers is, where did it go? It's an entity collection, not just an eye collection anymore. And I'm going to get rid of this. It's aggravating. The other thing I want to point out is here we're at runtime deriving from, we've got the dynamic proxy in here. So it's not deriving from the entity object at runtime. Dynamic proxy is different, although it provides a lot of the same behavior. I'm just trying to get into entity wrapper. So this is where we get, this is what gives us all of the capabilities that it's going to get now. So if I go ahead and ask for favorite beers, it automatically went and did the lazy loading. So it just automatically went and hit the database for me. So I got the behavior that I would have gotten with an entity object. I don't need to load property. I'm just going to run through that anyway. And then again, with this making a change, I don't have to wait until I call detect changes to get there for the context to understand that change has been made. This now, the person object is now able to notify the context that something just changed. So the context is immediately aware of that. Okay, so that gives you behavior that's closer to entity objects without actually being entity objects. Okay, moving on very quickly now. Just the CAN templates. The Entity Framework team blogged just last week, I think on Friday, that they've got the new POCO template up on the Visual Studio Gallery. So if you look at blogs.msdn.com/ADOnet, it's their most recent post, and you can see how to get the template that will automatically create the virtual properties. The simple POCO classes that have the virtual properties, and it does have some additional logic in there to fix up relationships and do things like that also. Okay. These, I'm probably not going to get through the demos on these, but these last couple of demos you can download from Microsoft's website. So this is really important. There's another T4 template that will create a very special type of class for you. It'll actually not only generate classes, your entity classes in a special way, but it'll generate a bunch of additional logic that you can put into your, that goes into your project. What the self-tracking entities do is solves the problem specifically for WCF, where as we go across processes, right now, Visual Studio 2008, we've got a lot of challenges for dealing with changes when you're going from a client back up to a service. How do you get the changes across? How do you know that there are changes? Entity Framework is very dependent on knowing what original values are on an entity in order to create update commands. And we lose all that information when we're working across processes in a service. I'm just going to do this anyway. So I just want to show you very quickly what happens here. The self-tracking entities. This is actually, I've tweaked it a little bit, but this is a demo directly from Microsoft, so they have a walkthrough on it on the IDEO.net team's website. I added this in here because this is what I care about the most. So when you run the template, so you have your model, you right-click on it, you create, generate new item, and you may have seen, we'll just do this, add code generation item. There's the self-tracking entity generator. So if you run that one, you'll get these specialized classes. So I'll open one of these up. So this is a lot more information in here than we would get if we were just using the simpler POCO template. The simple POCO template doesn't put all these attributes in here. These are for serialization. These are really important for serialization. So this is specifically written for use with WCF. So you don't want to use this with Astoria. You don't want to use this generically. Just use this if you're going to be working with WCF. So you can see that the class inherits or implements two interfaces. One's called iObject with change tracker, and another one that will do notification. So notification, if you're attached to a context, it will go ahead and notify the context. And the change tracker is critical because it gives it additional properties to let it store values, store information about relationships, and store information about original values, so that as you move across processes, the entity owns that information, because by default the context owns the information, and the context does not go across processes along with the entities. So that is really the most important piece of it. So there's a lot of goop in here, a lot of code that's automatically generated by the template that keeps track of all this information. So it's recording original value, right? It's setting up an on-property changed event or method. So it's able to do all of that stuff, and I'm just going to stop in one place after I do that edit. So this, I have I'm not going to walk through this. There's a whole walkthrough on the Entity Framework team's website of this code. So I'm not going to bother walking through it. I just want to show you to me, what are the key things here. So I'm doing an edit. So I've grabbed something I've called the service. I've asked it to give me back a graph. It's a blog post along with some of the comments. I'm drilling into one of the comments, and then I'm going to modify the comment. So before I modify the comment, I want to take a look at it. I'm going to drill into the base. This is where all the change tracking information is. And if you look, you can see there's nothing here at all. Just focus on the counts. They're all 0. Okay, we'll look at them again in a moment. Now I'm going to edit that. So remember, I am on the client side now. I called the service, brought it back across the wire. I'm on the client. The client doesn't know anything about the object context or entity framework or any of that. It's just all it knows about is these classes and whatever logic was transported along with these classes. So as I make that change and I go back and look in the comment again, to quick watch into the change tracker, notice it said, oh, you changed something. I better store that original value. All right, this is the last time I did it, which was yesterday, January 26th. So that was the last time I edited that piece of information. So now as this comment goes back to the service, to this update post with comments, it's going to bring that information along with it. And on the service side, there's code which will call an additional special logic, special methods that were created by the template. This one right here is the most important. It's called apply changes. So that is part of the self-tracking entities. It's now it's a method on the context, and that will know how to read the original values and build up the commands so that save changes can build up the proper commands. So what this does is it gets all of the entities in the graph into the exact state that they need to be in order for save changes to be able to build the proper commands, whether they're add, delete, or update commands. So I wish we had this in Entity Framework itself, but it's very specialized logic that depends on the fact that you're using the self-tracking entity. So it's really, really hard to write this generic logic. So this is really awesome to be able to have. So there's a lot more to learn about the self-tracking entities, but not today, or not this morning. A couple other things I want to point out. I'm not going to drill into them. This is not some, you won't need these if you're using self-tracking entities, but if you're doing anything else across processes, your own services, or you're using websites, things like that, it's possible. One of the big problems we had in Visual Studio 2008 when we go across processes and we lose all our state information is we needed more control. We did not have enough control over being able to change the state and impact the state. We wanted to be able to say, hey, I know that that was modified, so let me fix the state up of this entity so that when I call save changes, the object context will build the correct commands for me. So these new commands, one of them is old, but they renamed it and gave it lots of friends. This is the most important one, object state entry change state. So being able to actually change the state from unchanged to modified, or from unchanged to added, or even from added to unchanged. There's a whole slew of reasons why you might want to do these different things. For example, if you have a graph of, say you created a new comment on an existing post, thinking about the self-tracking entities we were just looking at, a new comment on an existing post. If the comment was attached to the context first, if I'm going to add that, I need to add the comment to the context, and the post is part of that graph. The post is going to get marked as though it's a new post, and that creates a problem when you go to save because it tries to insert it into the database. So that's the default behavior. So there's a case where knowing that post pre-exists, you'll want to be able to fix that after the fact. You want to change the state so you can say, no, it's not added. This is unchanged. Don't do anything with this. So this gives us a lot more control. The last thing that I wanted to make sure you're aware of, and this is a whole presentation unto itself, is something that's available not out of the box with Dev 10, with Visual Studio 2010, but it's part of something called the Entity Framework Feature CTP. And it provides the ability to not have a model at all when you're working with Entity Framework. So that's why it's called code only. So it's code only, no model. So it uses a lot of the POCO support that we've looked at already, and it's able to look at classes, and on the fly, it's able to create the very important metadata information that normally is provided by the model, and it creates that on the fly so that Entity Framework can do the job that it needs to be able to do. Now, with the POCOs that we looked at, it was really critical that the POCOs align, the POCO classes align with the entities, and so that's completely by convention. The POCO support makes assumptions that those things will line up. With a code-only support, you start with the assumptions, but there's a lot of things you can do to tweak it. So that's why it's called convention over configuration. So it's convention. It uses convention first. It uses the assumptions, but then you can use configuration to tweak those assumptions. Additionally, what this will be able to do is leverage what we saw with the model first, and it will be able to, it can create a database on the fly for you too, based on those entities that it created on the fly from the classes. So it looks at the classes using the information from the classes as well as the extra configuration that you've added into your classes, into your logic. It is able to create the model and also automatically create a definition for a database and create the database. So now you've got the full process where you can go from your classes to your conceptual model and then mapping all the way back through to the database. So now you can do queries, you can do updates, you can get all of the benefits that you get from Entity Framework and the change tracking and the relationship management, but you don't have to use a model. There's a lot of people who are very excited about this. Catherine, maybe we'll do a whole presentation on this someday soon. So 10 was a little much, but it was hard to cut it down even further than that. There's so much more in the new version of Entity Framework to take advantage of and to be pretty excited about, but not to talk about today. And so if you've used Visual Studio 2008, I highly recommend that if it's at all possible to move to Visual Studio 2010 to take advantage of all this new stuff in Entity Framework. Please, I will help you convince your bosses. I know that's really, really hard to do, but there's so much in Entity Framework 4 that's going to really simplify development with Entity Framework. I really, really recommend it. So that is it. You'll have access to, I'll put this slide deck up on pointer to my website, and I'll send a link to O'Reilly for it also. And you can, the webcast will be available, I think, in a week. Maybe Catherine will tell you a little more about that.
Hopefully sooner than that, Julie.
Sooner? Oh, last time I thought it took about a week. All right.
It did, but we're quicker these days.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're quicker because that'll make up for the extra 10 minutes I just stole.
Well, do you have time for a couple quick questions?
I would love to answer questions if people want to hang out. I'm totally happy to.
Okay. Well, one Jonathan just asked, and it's probably the easiest to answer quickly, is how easy is it to mock entities for in-unit or X-unit testing?
For somebody like me, it's a little more work, but you can mock entities. I've done it, and what I'm doing, I'm mocking them manually. You can also use one of the mocking frameworks. But there was on one of these last slides, the more. There's this thing in here called the object set. Object set is now how entities are returned when you do queries. An object set inherits from something called iObject set. And because of that disconnect, we can actually build mocks. I've actually built my first repository. I've got a series of blog posts. I actually wrote the whole repository in the unit testing before I started the series, but I still haven't written the last blog post, which is the one that shows the actual unit testing. But it's got all the mocking in there. So absolutely, you can do it. And what's cool to see is, I'm not coming from that world, so that's new to me and I'm learning. But what's really cool to see is the people who are very, very experienced Agile developers starting to dig into Entity Framework and build their repositories and their examples with, so much more knowledge about that side of the world than I'm bringing to the table.
Okay, and then I'm going to go back to a question that came in back when you were talking about the designer, just because I promised I would ask it.
Okay.
And it is, Jamie was asking, how much control does the developer have over the generated SQL DDL?
That's a great question. The generated DDL is actually generated through a T4 template, so you can go back into that you can modify that T4 template and control how it's generated. There's also there's two pieces to this. One is properties and things you can set in the model, but then the other is the impact of let me finish that thought. Properties that you can set in the model that impact things. I think I showed like the store generated pattern and the namespace and things like that you can impact. But how that code is generated you can impact by modifying the T4 template. I haven't done it yet. But
you will.
Can. Someday.
Okay. Okay, and then, and you may have answered this. Desmond asked it very early when you were still talking about the designer too. What about update database from model?
I'm not sure what you're asking. If you're saying I actually showed it. Update database from model already existed, and it's still there.
You probably asked that before you covered it. That was early.
Okay. So you can, if you make changes to the model, if you make changes to the database, you can update the model based on the database. Now, if you're going the other way, if you're doing the model first and you make changes to the model and you want to update the database, they aren't able to do change tracking on the model so that you can tweak the database. You're actually going to create a whole new database schema. So you have to do things like, save out your data, right, so you don't overwrite all of it. So it's not truly iterative in that way, but it's pretty good. Except for that,
he just posted manually, which means can you do it manually, or is that done manually? I don't know. Desmond, I'm sorry, I don't really understand.
Working in the XML manually is really tough. If you want to, whoever that was, if you want to just email me or leave a comment on my blog or something like that, I can get a little further into understanding what it is you're trying to accomplish and answer the question better.
He says that he'll do that. So let me. We had a couple others. One person asked, "What will there be support for Oracle?"
Oh, there is support for Oracle. It's just not provided by Microsoft. There are 2 third-party Oracle providers that support Entity Framework right now. One is from Dynamic Data, and the other is from DevArt. And Oracle seems to be working on one. That's all I can say about that. I thought they were working on one. We don't hear much from them, but hopefully they're working. I'm presuming Oracle is going to provide Entity Framework support at some point, also in their own provider. There's a lot of third-party provider support for lots of databases. Okay,
good. And here's a question I think is important. If our company isn't planning on upgrading to Visual Studio 2010 in the near future, will we still be able to use Entity Framework 4 within VS 2008 with some kind of workaround?
That's a good question. So I actually did a blog post the other day about being able to use the Entity Framework. If you're using if you're using Visual Studio 2010 but developing against .NET 3.5, you can take advantage. I know that's not your question, but I just want to finish that. You can take advantage of some of the new designer things. For example, even if you're developing for .NET 3.5, you can still get the pluralization. You can get the pluralization support from the designer. You can do model first. You can create complex types. If you are physically using Visual Studio 2008, you cannot use .NET 4 in there. As far as I know, I don't believe that. I mean, not even Entity Framework 4, but .NET 4, right? Because Entity Framework 4 is part of .NET. However, if you're looking for the POCO support, there is a POCO adapter that was written by somebody on the Entity Framework team, and it's on. They have a code gallery page. Code gallery is code.msdn.com or code.microsoft.com. No, I don't even have it here. If you go to the My Resources page, you get a link to the Code Gallery site. Anyway, they've got a POCO adapter you can use in Visual Studio 2008 with .NET 3.5, and I've heard lots of great things about it.
Okay, we still have questions coming in, but we're losing people, so I think we better call it a day for this. And I just want to thank you,
well,
Julie.
Catherine, if you want to email me the list of questions, I can answer them in a blog post.
That would be great, and I'll do that. I'll do that as soon as we get off. So I've seen a few people say it. Great presentation. I agree. You give an awesome presentation, Julie. So thank you so much for doing this. And people were asking about the book. It's in rough cuts, and I believe that you get a discount if you buy the rough cuts. You get a discount on the final book. I'm sorry, I don't have all the details on that. Now, I did offer you a discount code for your purchases from O'Reilly. It's Forecast. But listen carefully. It will give you 40% off books, 50% off ebooks. Unfortunately, it isn't valid with rough cuts, so that'll be a little frustrating. But if you want to buy Julie's current book, you can get a 40 or 50% discount. So that's sales pitch done.
And a lot of the concepts in the current book will still be completely valid for the new book. It's just really for Entity Framework 4. It's just really important, I think, if you're looking at the first version of the book, but you're planning on using Visual Studio 2010, I highly recommend looking at this what I did today, right? This what's new content, so you understand what's changed. So that as you look at the first book, like the first bunch of chapters on querying, all that stuff's the same, right? But there's no mention of foreign keys in my book, so there's a little more attention paid to how to get to foreign keys. Right, because it's a little more of an issue. And some of the patterns in the larger applications towards the end of the book are definitely changing, and the WCF patterns are changing. So that book is still viable, and of course, if you're using Visual Studio 2008, that's the one you want anyway.
Okay. Well, we better close out this meeting. Just again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and let's do it again sometime in the near future.
Yes, as you know, I can just talk and talk about Entity Framework. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great day.
All right. Goodbye.